Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're doing a complete overview of the identity of the Bride of Christ and the Remnant Church. We're impartially unpacking an amazing facts study guide that actually claims to solve one of the most complex, hotly debated biblical mysteries in history. They're tackling all the big questions raised regarding biblical prophecy, specifically by decoding the interpretation of Revelation chapters 12 and 14 to identify one true end-time church. So we are going to look closely at their specific interpretation and break down exactly how they arrive at their conclusions, relying entirely on the clues provided in their study material.
Okay, let's dive right into this because the central question the source raises is just fascinating. I mean, with literally thousands of churches out there today calling themselves Christian, but differing so widely in their interpretations and practices, how does someone know for sure which one is the true bride of Christ? Well, the source material tackles this by using the book of Revelation basically as a literal detective's checklist. They argue that Jesus didn't just leave this up to guesswork. Instead, they say he provided highly specific prophetic clues to pinpoint one true end-time church. So here's our logical roadmap for today's investigation. We'll be mapping out this complex prophetic timeline step by step. First, decoding the pure woman. Next, the dragon in the wilderness. Then defining the remnant, checking out the 6-point checklist, and finally, the big reveal. Let's get started. Section 1. Decoding the pure woman, symbols of the true church. Let's begin with the very first set of clues found over in Revelation chapter 12. The study guide treats these ancient verses almost like a cipher to be decoded. Basically, it divides all of Christianity into two main biblical metaphors. On one side, you've got a pure, faithful woman, representing Jesus' true church. And on the flip side, the text contrasts her with a harlot, or Babylon, which symbolizes false or apostate churches. This duality is totally foundational to the entire study guide. It sets up this incredibly stark contrast between spiritual purity and spiritual compromise. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is exactly how the source decodes the celestial clothing the woman is wearing in Revelation 12. She is clothed with the sun, which the guide says represents Jesus, his gospel, and his righteousness. Then you have the moon under her feet. They say that represents the Old Testament sacrificial system. And, just like the literal moon reflects the sun, this system only had spiritual value because it reflected the light of the coming Messiah. Finally, she wears a crown of 12 stars, symbolizing the foundational work of the 12 apostles in the early New Testament church. Section 2. The Dragon and the Wilderness, the prophetic conflict. Of course, this pure woman doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? To understand the timeline, we have to introduce the main antagonist of this biblical mystery. Enter the dragon. Now, the source's interpretation asks us to look past the metaphor to the actual entity behind it, and they specifically want you to imagine this dragon strictly as a wicked-faced fallen angel in a priest's tunic, explicitly avoiding any beast-like features here, like horns or claws. It's meant to emphasize spiritual rebellion. This fallen angel is Satan, cast out of heaven, who the study guide says worked historically through pagan Rome, specifically King Herod, to target the male child, Jesus. But, as the text notes, this plot completely fails to destroy the ascended Christ. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. Because since the dragon couldn't destroy Jesus, he turns all his fury on the woman, the church. And this kicks off a massive historical sequence. The guide outlines a wilderness period where the true church is literally forced into hiding. They use a prophetic formula here, found in Ezekiel, where one prophetic day equals one literal year. So follow the math. The 1,260 days mentioned in Revelation become 1,260 literal years. According to the text, this grueling period of papal prominence and intense persecution lasted from AD 538 all the way to 1798. And during that entire time, the true church had no official visible organization. Section 3. Defining the remnant church. So this brings us out of the wilderness and right into the modern era. The source now shifts gears from ancient history to hunting for the specific group that survives this grueling 1,260-year timeline to emerge on the other side. To find them, we really need to unpack the specific vocabulary the study guide uses. The text uses the word remnant to describe these end-time believers. Now, in a literal sense, a remnant is just the last remaining portion of a piece of fabric, but it's identical to the original role. In this context, it represents God's true church of the very last days, maintaining the exact original apostolic faith and based entirely on Scripture. On top of that, the guide emphasizes the Greek word ecclesia, which gets translated as church. Literally, though, it means the called out ones. The source is stressing here that believers are being specifically called out of the world, and importantly, called out of fallen Babylon, to join this specific remnant fold of safety. Section 4.
the 6-point checklist from Revelation.
Okay, this sets up absolutely the most crucial part of the source's argument. According to the Amazing Facts Guide, Jesus didn't just leave believers to guess who this remnant is. Instead, Revelation chapters 12 and 14 allegedly provide a highly specific 6-point biblical checklist to identify his church today. Let's walk through the first 4 prophetic clues they derive from their reading. Clue 1. The church would not exist as an official organization between AD 538 and 1798. Clue 2 follows that logically. It must arise after 1798. Clue 3, this group has to keep all 10 of the original commandments, and they emphasize this explicitly includes the seventh-day Sabbath. And Clue 4, according to Revelation 12:17, they must possess the testimony of Jesus, which the source decodes as possessing the gift of prophecy. Continuing the checklist, we hit the final 2 specifications, and these severely narrow the search criteria on a global scale. Clue 5 dictates that this cannot just be some localized sect. It has to function as a worldwide missionary church. And Clue 6, which is perhaps the most specific of all, states that this church must actively preach what is known as the 3 angels' messages, found in Revelation chapter 14.
Section 5, unpacking the 3 angels' messages. Because that 6th point is just so incredibly specific, we need to pause and explain it in a bit more detail. The study guide heavily emphasizes this unique theology found in Revelation 14, arguing that without preaching these 3 distinct messages, a church literally cannot be the remnant. So the crucial point is how the source interprets the first angel. The guide claims that the first angel's message announces that God's heavenly judgment officially began in the year 1844. Furthermore, this message commands all people to worship God specifically as the Creator, which the source ties directly back to observing the seventh-day Sabbath as a memorial of that creation. The interpretations of the second and third angels? Well, they are incredibly bold. The second message is a direct call to come out of Babylon, which the text identifies as those fallen or apostate churches we mentioned earlier. The third message is a severe warning. Do not worship the beast or receive its mark. And here's the kicker. The study guide identifies this mark of the beast, not as some sci-fi microchip or a barcode, but specifically as observing Sunday as a holy day instead of the biblical seventh-day Sabbath. The source emphasizes a very urgent warning against what it calls spiritual counterfeits. Section 6, the reveal, identifying the true church. Which finally brings us to the climax of this entire prophetic detective narrative. We have our 6-point checklist, we have the specific theology required. Applying this matrix to modern history, the Amazing Facts Study Guide concludes that only one church on earth fits every single specification perfectly. According to the text, the Seventh-day Adventist Church began to form in the early 1840s, meaning after 1798. They strictly keep Saturday as the seventh-day Sabbath. They claim the prophetic gift. They are a massive worldwide missionary organization, and they uniquely teach those 3 angels' messages of Revelation 14. Therefore, the source concludes definitively that this is God's remnant church. And this brilliantly illustrates the source's ultimate call to action. To really drive the urgency home, the study guide compares our modern day to the days of Noah. Just as there was only one way of escape during the global flood, the ark, the source claims that the remnant church is the single end-time vehicle of safety provided by God. They even quote Genesis 7:1 as an urgent, open invitation for viewers to get on board before it's too late. But the study guide actually closes with a pretty stern warning. They say, even if you recognize the truth of this checklist, everyday distractions can cause you to miss this prophetic boat. They list these spiritual traps, straight from the book of Luke. Surfeiting, which means overdoing anything, even perfectly good things. Drunkenness, which they define super broadly as anything that gives a distaste for heavenly things. The mundane cares of this life, just crowding out your study time. And finally, spiritual sleeping, being completely unaware of the prophetic times we are allegedly living in right now. As we wrap up this explainer on the identity of the Bride of Christ, we are really left with a heavy proposition from the source material. We've mapped out their decoding of the pure woman, that massive 1,260-year wilderness period, and the highly specific 6-point checklist from Revelation 12 and 14, all of which leaves us with this provocative thought. If the clues in biblical prophecy are truly as literal and as specific as this Amazing Facts Study Guide claims they are you confident you are in the right fold? It's an absolutely fascinating look into the interpretation of prophecy, and something that certainly invites every focused learner to dig deeper into the source text for themselves. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.